until very recently, it just was a bit embarrassing. Like, I got the feeling that we made a first very important move forward with that first change in kind of approach, which is, I think, a statement. You could say something like this. I think it's a basic new statement about intrinsic properties of mode B, which is it is flexible, which is not obvious because it's not common to associate classical logic with flexibility, right? And plasticity. And that idea that we're looking at this wrong, like the state is not, you should, if you hypothesize the modern state, you get this feeling of ossified bureaucratic machinery. But if you remove yourself from that point of view to look at historically what the state needs to do all the time, you can see that it's actually very plastic, adapted to many situations. So we had to explain how can it be based on classical logic and be that plastic, right? And I think that was the first issue, which is, okay, how do we account for this? And then the second issue, which I think it's something we started to look into, is that, and I think like part of it is accounted for by this fact, the very fact that we're talking about classical logic. Perhaps we shouldn't even call it classical logic. We're talking about a Boolean logic, because classical logic, this is also something that I think we learned especially from mode A. When we were researching mode A and we started looking into papers on paraconsistent logic, most people who study paraconsistent logic are coming from logic, and they studied logical systems. So the papers are about systems, and therefore everything they have to say about it is about the whole system. But we don't want to start from a global guaranteed consistency and then talk about the properties of the system in general. We started with the total stuff because it has local logic and it takes effort to build global consistency, right? So like most of the literature on paraconsistent logic is about, there is this system F3, which is a paraconsistent system with this and that property. And now I'm going to prove it's consistent and it's reasonable to work with it. But it's not interesting for us that there exists a complete formal system which has properties X, Y, and Z. Because for social exchange and social construction, you need something which is valid only locally, and then you can describe which specific conditions you need to add to increase the coherence of that space into bigger and bigger chunks, right? So, for example, if you look at this movement here with value, this is where you get the simple form of exchange, right? Here you get the expanded form of value form. Here you start getting the universal equivalent form. And here you get money. So this is step by step increasing the consistency of the things you can talk about and exchange, because you're refining the object that relates everything in that space. So we don't want it. It makes no sense to just have like a paper of intuitionistic logic that says that there is a system that is intuitionistic. Like that wouldn't help us, right? So we needed this kind of stepwise construction. And with classical logic, this is even more so the case. Like classical logic, when you already assume the whole system is classical, right? And that everything you're going to talk about is already guaranteed to function classically, you miss the problem that interests us, which is, well, what if locally you manage to engage with somebody in a way such that the rules of classical logic hold? What other guarantees you need so that further interactions with that logic will be coherent with the first, right? Like the very fact that it's meant to be self-evident, the rules of classical logic are meant to be self-evident to apply everywhere, hides the fact that we actually want to know the conditions that take you from locally being valid to regionally being valid to globally being valid, right? So I think that's something that got in our way, and that once you recuperate that question, right? Like, but under which conditions are, and this is something that, again, linear logic seems very good because it's all about under which conditions can inferences be made and blah, blah, blah. But once you recuperate that question, it becomes easier to understand why something that's classical can be plastic, because you need to add conditions to grow a structure that will respect this form of logical coherence, right? So I think that that's something that it's becoming clearer recently, but it wasn't right. That this flexibility, one of its reasons, I think it's not the only reason, but one of its reasons is it is connected to thinking Boolean logics locally, and not starting from. So we're not starting from the logician's take on logic. We're starting from the mathematician's take on logic, because category theory allows you to start from, no, this is only valid locally here under specific conditions. Like, I don't know how to generalize it. Logicians, they tend to get a lot for free because they're like talking about the structure of reasoning. So it's in general, the structure of, being. So it's in general, but you don't want that. You want, like, just because I know that locally in this space, connections are respect Boolean values, what else do I need to be able to stitch together other parts of the world, other contexts that will respect those same principles, right? That's slightly different, I think.
Yeah, I think one thing that's and it sounds like Alan was in a similar kind of position. One of the things that both linear logic and then our research on like the different kind of Heyting algebras show that in order to get Boolean, you actually have to combine the other two, right? So in a weird kind of way, it's like not really three distinct logics, but two base logics that when they come together make mode B. And I think when we first started thinking about it, that seemed more like a restriction, right? That in a way, like you're cutting out more. But I think maybe part of what this opens up is it's more like having two distinct kind of logical tools or logical sensors. So it's actually more that you have in a weird kind of way. Though I suspect it's actually a bit of both. Just haven't really kind of teased that out.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I still don't understand. I know that this is the intuitive way of thinking about that, in my opinion, is just knowing, right? Like, if you have truth and false, and you're allowed to have something in between. Here we are at the level of mode C. And if you are in the level of mode A, where you're allowed to have truth and false, and you're allowed to have something which is both true and false here. Something like this. Well, it kind of catches your attention that this thing here is included in both of them, right? So it sounds like this is a subcase of the upper two, because if I say mode C and then I add a proviso, but avoid intermediary, and if I have mode A and say but avoid contradictions, I add a clause and I get mode B. So it kind of creates the impression, I think. At first, this is just an intuitive level, and now we know that there is a structure you can use to actually bind the three together, which is something called a bi-Heyting algebra, right? So like it just maps all of it. But it kind of gives you the feeling, I think, that you have something like this, where you have C and A, and like if you invert the two, one becomes the other. Because it's true that, like, say, if you have something like A and B, and you create like an upper way of connecting the two things, like A and B have nothing in common, okay? They are perfectly separated. You can create something which is here on top of them. If you can do this infinitely, you're on mode C. And if having A and B, you can create an intersection between them here. And you can do this infinitely, you are in mode A. So like when we spoke with mathematicians about this, like, hey guys, how about para-consistent topos, blah, blah, blah. They said, it's not interesting. It's the same thing. You just turned it upside down. Right? Like, because being able to do this and saying like, well, they have nothing in common, but you can get something on top. And saying they have nothing in common, but you can go downward.
Yeah.
Like for them, it's the same. It's not even a duality in like a categorical sense of like, but you explore interesting qualities in their asymmetry. They are really inverts. So that's why they don't like to talk about this with us, because on the pure mathematical side, this looks kind of cheap. Some philosophers and logicians and a very small group of mathematicians are exploring this as something, this inversion as something useful, but that's not that common. And then, but the other side is that there is some type of restriction here and some type of restriction here. Both lead you to mode B. Right? So it's, as John was saying in his first presentation, like, it's not true that these three are three separate things. Because if A and C are inverts, that means that they are very strictly connected. And if B is inside both of them, that also means they're very connected, right? So this is just something that we're starting to realize, and apparently you can, this has some relation with this thing called a bi-heighting. This is usually
except significantly, it becomes properly contravariant, right? Because that's what happens when you lift it up to a higher level structure, is instead of B being included in A and C, then you have A and C included in B. And that's, I think, the interesting thing about mode B that we can kind of tap into. At a higher level structure, it encompasses them. At a lower level structure, it's like a restriction of them.
Yeah, because but the bi-heighting is not a Boolean.
No, it's not a Boolean, but it's what like enables it's what gives, it's a condition of possibility for making Boolean statements.
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to say, yeah, but it's still, I think that the idea that you need to restrict to get to mode B is still valid. Like, it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. But we can think about this like that's the basic logic of a sheaf in general, right? On one side, you're restricting, but on the other side, you're actually increasing. So it's kind of like zooming in with a microscope. As you restrict your total field of vision, you're actually getting more information.
But I think that this already gives like an interesting sense, which is something like when we first started studying the three modes with this logical approach, this intuition came up, which is, well, if this is the case, this little diagram is the case, then it tells us some things. First, if these are restrictions, it tells you that, you know, mode B is like an internal menace. Like, it's always there until, you know, you don't need to add anything to get to mode B. You need to remove something to get to mode B. And I think that this is amazingly clear, especially here. You know, like a lot of these accounts of the emergence of the state through the encounter of two communities in war, and then the outcome of war is different, and that leads to a type of domination and a new type of enslavement and so on. You can see it's not because the logic of menace. It's not because you add something new, like, and then they were particularly perverted, and then they were particularly whatever, you just remove, like if you remove certain rituals, if you remove certain types of gift connections that would make it that how you treat the defeated says something about you. You know, if you suspend that, which is what, for example, giving people an honorable death. You know, you cannot turn them into slaves that work for you if you treat them with the dignity that you ascribe yourself. So if you go to war with people and then you need to kill them because that's taking them seriously, so to speak, right? There can be no domination. The moment that you spare people, but spares them in a humiliating way, right? You actually stopped short of how far mode A would go. You didn't go further. I think that that's a very weird idea to think about, like, because we don't talk about mode A war like violence, right? And the idea that violence is less than an honorable war, like it's not more than it. It's not like you go further after. It's that you stop short of honor, not that you go further. I find that very counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that like you might, rather than decimating your opponent, you know, you will say, no, that's enough. And that will be the tipping point, right? I think that that's very, very weird way of approaching it, but it does make some weird sense. So I don't know. I think that that's sorry, yeah.
I'm still with the inversion thesis because what's troubling for me is that on the logical level, this doesn't look at all like a trivial inversion, right? I mean, like paraconsistent logics and intuitionist logics look very different. And so, I mean, like, I'm wondering, is there like a discrepancy between those two levels then there?
Yeah,
concerning the inversion.
Yeah, the way that I know how to explain this is that I think that the first thing is that the two things that I would do to make it clearer is that if you start with the semantics, so truth, falsity, like contradiction in that sense of, I think it makes it less clear, because the good thing about this more topological treatment is that you can see first the relations between parts, and then you can see if the complement, right? I mean, you would get to this. This is how, anyone interrupts me if you think I'm going on a less useful thing, but the way that I understand it is that you don't start from this. You actually start from defining the way we've done it, right? You define like how you organize the topology of these places, of these spaces, right? And what's the relation between these parts? And then you define, for example, things like given the part P, you will build the concept of negation. So you will say, well, if I can define what is like a subset P here, now I want to define what's the complement of that. Actually, I'm going to define the complement of P, which is going to be a certain, and we're going to base the theory of negation that fits in that space in this way, right? And the theories of the topology and the negation part here is that's going to actually correspond to this semantics. So when you look at this level here of the topology, and then the way you extract complements out of it, you can then see that the tendency, the way that you're actually presenting things when you're describing an intuitionistic space, is that if you have some predicate, some part, and you take the complement of that part, there might be something missing that's not part of it. That's neither in the part nor the complement of the part. So if you want to take the whole, you need to go up to some other thing. Whereas when you're in a paraconsistent space and you have some part P, when you take the complement of P, it might already include things that were in P. Right? So you already have everything, even though the complement and the thing by definition are separate. Which means that even though there is something empty here, there's actually an intersection here. And you can do this kind of procedure downward. Right? You can see you can create like a weird intersection between things that have no intersection. So in this sense, they are inverted. And then if you look, they have this idea that you have, I always confuse this, is intuitionistic tuples have finite meets, right? No, finite joins, no, finite meets.
Finite meets, finite intersections. Yeah.
Finite intersections. So this way down, it's finite, and infinite unions, right? You can always take this upper union of the thing. But if you go down, you'll get, whereas what is the pair consistent structure? It's just the contrary. Infinite intersections and finite unions. So in this sense, they are kind of mirrored. I don't know what's the symbol for mirrored. Just, yeah, so they're just inverted that way. So there is a really nice paper by a guy called Luis Estrada Gonzalez. It's called the evil twin. They even call this the complement tuples. They don't even call it like a dual, because what mathematicians sometimes claim is that you just relabel. Like, what's the difference between this and this structure? No, you could just have inverted and relabeled it, and you would get the same thing. So there is something that sounds too weak to be called a different structure. That's how they take it. But like, once you define this and you define this, then you ask like, how are truth and falsity statements behaving here? And the idea is that they behave in this way. If I take the complement of a truth statement, I might miss something. And here, if I take the complement of a true statement, there might be part of the true statement inside the false or vice versa, right? So if you start straight up with the semantics of truth and falsity and so on, it's hard to see how it's inverted. But if you go back to the spatial description and just look at the spatial structure, you will see that it's just this upward going or downward going. So yeah, that's as far as I can tell. Like perhaps there is a better description. I'm not sure if Dennis or John can jump in on that, but that's as far as I get it. One thing that I will say that I'm curious about is that, you know, like we used in the Atlas this quote from Jean-Pierre Marquis, it's a category theorist, saying, well, category theory is like building a space station. You know, it has no gravity. And structures, no structure is fundamental. There's no bottom and up because simply you're in space. And it got me thinking if this isn't a moment where you can see the shortcomings of that, because things that are inverted in space, they are the same, right? If there is nothing to ground you, like, of course, this way up or this way up is the same. But for us, clearly it's so different, like evidently it's different. So it's almost like we're using one structure, but with gravity. And when you add gravity to it, once you add mass to it, whatever that means, mathematically speaking, but once you add the mass to this structure, then you can tell up from down, and then you can see it's not trivial to invert, you know? But what does that mean? I just think it's a nice image.
Yeah, I just wanted to add here that for me, to tell the difference between these three forms is by looking at what happens on the boundary, right? So, like you're saying, if you're not on the boundary, all three of them kind of behave the same. It's only when you have some, but then you need some conceptual framing of what boundary means, right? If you want to talk about it in the context of a social world or some kind of political effects or something like that, like you need to think about what fits on the boundary. Because in the case of Boolean, the boundary is both empty and it exists. In the case of intuitionistic, it is non-empty. Right, sorry, so in the case of paraconsistent, it's non-empty. Right, the boundary has something. Because when you take the negation of the complement, you share a boundary together. Right, and then in the case of intuitionistic, you don't share anything, right? But there is a boundary. It's a non-empty boundary that is not shared by either the A nor its complement. Yeah, exactly. The cut, margin, and frontier.
Like this I think it's really good already to get the feeling of inversion. Like value it allows things to be very heterogeneous with no common ground. Value is never, like a capitalist is never asking what does these two things have in common. It's actually usually asking like what is the package that contains these two things. You know, it's an ontological difference between packaging and finding common ground, right? Like mode A is always, you give two things, you can always find a common ground between them. And then I give you a third thing, you can find a common ground. And it doesn't need to be a good thing, it can be pure hatred, it doesn't matter. But you can look down to find what's the ground beneath the two things. Capital is never asking what's the ground beneath two things, like what's the use of finding that out, right? The use is of how do I combine two things? Like capital is trying always to decompose things until they become different and then recompose them with the sameness going up, right? You wouldn't say, well, but the worker and the means of production, they have in common value. Value is the substance. No, that's not really how it goes. Like when you go down, you need work to bind things together. They're not given that they're bound, right? But when you go upward by recombining them, you get a commodity. It's always waiting you back when you recombine things. With mode A, it seems to be the inverse, where upwards looking things become more and more different. Like groups that build their mythologies, cosmogonies, they become more and more different. Families, as they develop, they become more and more different. And when you go down, you find back what they have in common, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like downward commonality, upward differentiation. And with capital is the opposite. Like upwards, you go towards capital, which includes a bunch of different things. You go towards monopoly, you go towards, the unification of things. And downward, you disseminate things, you make them different, and you want to explore the little differences and so on. Right? So for example, I think that it's a really good way of seeing, there's a lot of literature on this idea of inversion between commodity and gifts. Let me just find, I have a good book reference here. I think they are all a bit, it's Gregory, I think guy's name. Yeah, Chris Gregory, Gifts and Commodities. It's a very famous book. I think they are all a bit weird at points because they don't really know how to tell these things apart. There's also an interesting paper by Postone. Let me see if I can find it. But they all have this idea. For example, you can have another type of comparison that anthropologists do a lot. Modes value pulls things towards the objects, and mode A pulls things towards the personal, right? It makes everything.
Thing, right? That in mode B, one side of it has a boundary and the other side does not. But what were you were saying something a bit different, that it was both there and not there?
Oh yeah, I think the way I see it is there there is a boundary, but it's empty. That's the way I interpret Clopin sets, right? So you have open sets, closed sets. Open sets don't have a boundary. Closed sets do have a boundary. And they're inversions of each other in the sense that their complements work very similarly. But in the case of Clopin sets, which they carry the Boolean algebra, yeah, I can think of it as two intervals meeting at a boundary, but that boundary is empty. And open sets, they don't ever meet. There is no boundary. And then closed sets have a boundary, so they meet at the boundary. So it's not, I don't think it's right to say that a Clopin set is one where one side has a boundary, the other side does not, because that is just a closed and an open set meeting.
Okay.
I think yeah, how would we characterize it? Yeah, I think it's hard to do that with intervals. But if we talk about like the intervals of the real line, we have that notation with the square braces. I can type it here. So like this is like this is a closed interval. This is an open interval, right? Clopin does not mean this or this. That's not Clopin. And then, but Clopin is when they're both open and closed. Right, so yeah, there's either side can be open, either side can be closed, they can be mixed, which is neither open nor closed. And then they can be both open and closed, and I'm not sure what is the correct the correct notation would be like this negative infinity to positive infinity. And the reason that is both open and closed is because points at infinity don't exist in the real line. So this is only valid for like the real line.
You're muted.
Oh, you're muted, John.
So this sounds similar to the idea that in order to get a Clopin set, you have to have the whole power set. Like you have to have the whole thing in order to actually be able to get Clopin in the first place. Once you start to break things up, you just have open and closed, right? You need to have both. You need to have the whole real number line in order to get Clopin, basically.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, yeah, how do we say that? Because it has its boundary, but the boundary is empty. The same goes for the null set, right? So a null set, we could write a null set as like 0, 0. Why is this null set? Because the only element here is 0, but since it's open, it can't contain that element. So it contains an empty boundary. Whereas this this notation here with the square braces is equal to the set containing just 0. Right? because 0, when you have the boundary is 0, right? But if you take out the boundary, what does it contain? It's empty, right? So the empty set is Clopin. And the whole set is Clopin. And in a normal topology, I guess those are the only two Clopin sets. Everything else is open.
So I mean, if we take that as a basic idea, then that seems to make a really interesting implication about the state, that the state, like that Hegel's basic argument that the state is kind of the structure of totalization is almost like correct in that sense. Like in order to be mode B, you have to try to cover the whole set then.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's part of it. Yeah, that you have to have reference to both the totality and to the null set.
And to the null set. So I wonder what the null set would be in our.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking like just like a political example is, when you refer to the bottom of society, like this quote I was using in a paper recently on let's see if I can find it again. The Combahee River Collective Statement, like the Black feminist statement from the 1977. Just this part here. And there's of course versions of this like everywhere, right? You have, but this quote says, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. So you have both the reference to the minimum, right? You assert that there exists something which is the bottom of everything, right? The lowest element. And then you connect that to the totality, because you say because in order to free this bottom element, you would have to change the top element. Right, and then obviously you have like the definition of the proletariat in Marx would be another example. Or like, yeah, and Palestinian struggle as well, the idea that like it's not we who frees Palestine, it's Palestine that frees everyone else, right? Because the struggle for Palestine is somehow at the nerve or the limit of the capitalist world.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot like that all makes a lot of sense. Which also means, and I think we've said this elsewhere, then that mode B is the proper logic of revolution, then, because that's the kind of how you could see that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, like can we even talk about revolution in a purely mode C or mode A way? Doesn't seem like that makes sense, right? Only when you have reference to some totality and some minimal element. By the way, Gabriel said his internet is down.
Oh crap. Okay.
Since I didn't catch the beginning of the meeting, what what kicked off this discussion of the modes?
We're doing kind of a recap, and then Maurice asked for more kind of specificity on the inversion between A and C, and that's kind of where we're at.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I'll be right back.
So Dennis, what you were saying about equating proletariat or black women with the empty set. So the idea behind that, is that right? That the quote kind of like exemplifies that the empty set is included in every set. Is that like kind of the idea?
Yeah. That's part of, yeah, the empty set is included, but does not belong to every set. So like if you have the set like 1, 2, 3, the empty set is not counted in one of the elements. It's not one of the elements of that set. But if you take the power set, you the empty set. So that's
So that's interesting. So in a way, like it's a matter of detecting the empty set. That then is what you need mode B for as well.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because the way Badiou kind of talks about the power set as like the state of the situation is seems like that, yeah. Right, and then that sets up the idea of forcing as a way of, right, because obviously for finite sets this is like not really possible, but with infinite sets you have the ability to find another set inside the power set that's not the empty set either, but you can then take this subset and add it to the original model, and that would be an extension. And then that allows you to say something new about express something new. So I was thinking like here within a system, you normally don't have a reference to the system as such, right? Like how do we put it? Most of the time a system can only refer to the elements that are modeled within that system. Or like if you think of something simple like a thermostat, right? Thermostats have access to the temperature, but it doesn't have access to itself as, you know, it cannot refer to like the thermostat as an entity. So you have this kind of layers of meta language where you have a system, and then in order to talk about that system, you need a bigger system that contains the first system, right? Yeah, no self-conscious thermostat. But when the Black feminist movement, for example, posits that they're at the bottom, and then in order to free themselves, they would need to take down capitalism, right? I mean, even when we in our everyday language talk about huge thing, we don't really know what we're talking about. We're kind of positing this thing that's on top of everything else. that's kind of like a thermostat trying to talk about itself, right? Not only the functioning. And so it always seems kind of silly in a way because it's very speculative. It's very like not grounded in the in. So I think that that's something to consider when we're talking about revolution, that it always like, well, it implies that the system you're in can be spoken about in the first place. And I think that has something to do with the generic extension in Cohen.
Yeah, it's been a while, but doesn't Badu say that essentially like his interpretation of Cohen is that when Cohen used constants, those are names, and by introducing a name, you're able to mark something that otherwise you wouldn't have been able to mark, or something like that?
Yeah.
So when we're talking about like, I mean, like black is like a good example, right? Like as something that is a name that is asserted as a fact in response to an oppression that wouldn't have been a necessary name without that system of oppression, but in making the name, it becomes possible to also name the system of oppression in a kind of way from the perspective of it's like this larger system that can overcome it.
Yes, exactly. And you know what it reminds me of is in your last presentation, John, you were talking about linear logic and Girard's schema here. Maybe I can share my screen too. Oh, it's disabled right now, but let's see.
Oh.
I don't know who's the host right now.
At least
Girls
I
here.
can do a recording. I don't know if that is a
You might be
sign
the
that I
host then.
turned into the host.
If you right click my name, do you see like some way you can give me sharing?
I
Oh,
think you
great.
should be co-host or something.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I can share now. So yeah, I was thinking, I remember this drawing. Oh, let me turn this off. Yeah, this drawing you had shown, John, of like at the bottom you have basically I think this is called like the phase diagram or something, right? Where you at the top you had I guess true statements, and the bottom you had false statements, and then you had verified statements here, right? And then there was like some other statements. Oh yeah, there were closed statements and open statements. Right. Okay. Anyway, I think this is maybe too much detail here, but I was thinking about how um, a verifiable statement is a statement that has an element that inhabits it. So if I say something, if I make a claim about some system of oppression, it might be that no one actually is being oppressed under that system. Like I can talk about that system without verifying that someone indeed falls under that description. So for example, I have a description, right? And then,
I just posted the picture you're talking about in the chat.
nice. Yeah, let me. Yeah, exactly. There's facts verified in P. And then there's facts which are not verified. And then there's duals of facts that are verified. I have no idea what the dual of verified fact is. Right, it makes sense to have, they're verified and non-verified, but then there's the dual of verified. It's interesting.
I think the dual of verified is everything that wouldn't be relevant to that fact.
Yes.
It would be all the pieces of information that don't make a difference, really. You can change them all you want, and it doesn't change the fact.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah. And then, yeah, this would be unverified.
What you can think of as like, if we're talking about political experimentation, and we, do a protest to see whether or not we can get more people to come out, or whether or not we can get some concession from the administration or whatever. We might find out that, like, no matter how we try to talk about certain things, we can't affect certain parts of a university or a town, right? Like, there might be certain kinds of things that no matter what we try to affect, there may not have any input, at least within a certain kind of scope of action, right? Because this is also relative too, to like a certain field. But yeah, I think a lot of this is questioning, like, it's a lot of linear logic seems to start from the question of, like, how do you differentiate what matters to a particular, like, problem that you're trying to solve if you don't already know what matters in a weird way.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that that's really a really useful way of thinking about it, because it's like you have, we want to be able to verify the facts on the ground. And that means also taking out everything that is things that you can't affect, right? So in this sense, verification is not even the right metaphor. It's more like salience or something, like relevance to the situation. I don't know. But yeah, what I was trying to get at though is, like, with the verified statements, that's equivalent to saying that there is a singleton set, which is usually indicated with this one, that belongs to the set described by this description, right? Or whatever fact you're trying to put forward. But the interesting about this way of thinking about it is that the empty set has no element, right? There's no, this is not true for the empty set. This is definitely not true, right? So this is another way of expressing this idea that the system doesn't have the resources to talk about the empty set. For any system, its bottom element is by definition like an unverified or not relevant fact. So the idea of extending this language is to take this description and other similar descriptions and add that back into the model. Right, so then you would extend the model. So that later on it can be, or in this extended model, you can verify new statements. Yeah. But yeah, we should definitely make some more time to talk about this. I do have to go pretty soon.
Yeah, it sounds like We might have to return to just some of the basic geometric intuitions about mode B, because I was definitely like relying heavily on half intervals to explain things. So uh I don't know. Yeah, I feel like so one of the things Gabriel kind of started out the conversation with was like we don't really have the kind of like full logical vocabulary we do for mode C, and especially because of the primer, and also mode A as we do for, or we have more for that than we do for B, but also B is strangely kind of like, from one perspective, if you look at just the truth values, right? Like B is contained in the truth values of paraconsistent or intuitionistic because it's smaller. But then if you turn around and you look at the like a larger system, like precisely like the example of the real set or the real number line, it's the Boolean structure that's the largest, right? So there's this weird kind of, and it's very kind of like sheaf-like, right? It's contravariant, right? Like as you shrink down the number of options to just like true or false, you need like a larger structure to be able to actually make that distinction. And I've interpreted that for a while as like that's why a state has to totalize, like has to expand, and tends to like get into everything, because it kind of has to get into everything just to even to have the structure to talk about facts in the first place. Because like the scheme we just talked about in terms of facts themselves are products of a Boolean like double logic or double negation. So to even produce a fact in linear logic, you have to have access to Boolean kind of resources. And so if we look at the state as being kind of concerned with like in Badiou's language, like knowing the state of affairs, then that's really like a structure that is capable of generating facts out of like these kind of like partial bits of information and data, and then once the fact is kind of framed, to actually kind of make sure that it like fits. Because yeah, instead of verified, we want to talk more about like relevance or something like that, where it's like is this information going to be relevant to our campaign to get unionized, right? Do we have to look at this particular aspect of the business and put pressure here? If we do this, if we go negotiate with these people, that won't matter to the boss, so it's not really relevant to the process of winning our union, kind of thing. But before you can even get there, you have to have a framework to first kind of determine how to even organize the information to then assess whether or not it's kind of like strategically relevant. And that seems to be a process that requires a Boolean framework to rule out all the irrelevant information.
Yeah, and I think, but yeah, there's something about that also, which I think is you lose some fidelity to the whole, to what can be expressed, right?
In B?
In B, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I actually wonder if in the language of the state, can the language of the state really talk about the state itself? It's almost like it can't, right?
Interesting.
Right, because for Badiou, right, the state of the situation is actually it makes no room for novelty.
Yeah.
Right, that's part of the problem with it. It's like it is totalizing, but it basically erases some, well, you could say like potential or whatever, like some original contingency of things, and it naturalizes things, and it makes it seem like this totality is all that there is. So while it seems like having the Boolean or the totalizing language is a necessity, it's not sufficient for what we're trying to describe. Right, so like you need it, like you said, in order to sort things out, to eliminate, to take out the irrelevant information. You do need it for that, but it doesn't, it's by itself, it's not enough, right? And that's where we start talking about the mode D, the necessity for something that's irreducible to the three things.
And that would be precisely like our logical critique of like top-down state socialism, you know, like the Nasserist
Mhm.
kind of projects, right? Like that the very thing they chose to like drive social revolution was incapable of introducing the novelty necessary.
Mhm.
And I think that'd be actually a really interesting way to distinguish like these top-down socialist projects from something like the Soviet apparatus, which was much more bottom-up and did seem to at least have the potential to introduce novelty into the situation.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like pausing midway between the two or something, and finding something. Some resources to in this middle area. Maybe because another way we can think about this, and I really have to go after this, but
Okay.
but like just to connect the previous thing here, if the top here is the negative infinity, positive infinity, here we have like 0, 0. So this is the empty set. Then what are these things? What are the verified points? They're the points in your model that actually, when you have a model of the real numbers, these are the real points. And maybe this, we don't have enough time to like to make this like completely rigorous, but like your model can have a certain number of points. And for Cohen, right, he was trying to show that there is a way we can find a set. It's possible to find a set in between the countable numbers and the continuum, or this whole thing, right? The entire real. So Cohen's would be like, here's your countable model or your ground model. And then you can extend it by taking these other this other stuff here.
The unverified?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. So it's almost like making relevant something that wasn't already relevant to the situation.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Huh.
Because it's not the unverified, it's not the dual of the verified, I don't think, but it's this unverified space.
Yeah, the in between the dual and the
Yeah, because dual is like, we know
Yeah.
that's not relevant. And if we think about here, what are the things here? They're actually what are the elements of this space? They are subsets of the real line. That's why at the top you have the whole real line, at the bottom you have 0, 0. So the real points would be your model of the reals, or your model of something, right? Your model set theory, let's say. And then you can add subsets to this from this space in between. Anyway, so another thing on the left here, I was just drawing, is that all of this stuff happens here, right, in ontology, which is like very kind of abstract, very, we don't really, doesn't really have any semantics to it. And then we in STP are trying to build the rest of this.
Yeah.
Right, so
exactly.
this is kind of like the STP stack here. For thinking about things, right? You have ontology at the bottom, you build phenomenology on top of that, and then you introduce organizations. So that's techtology. And then once you have all three of those things, then you can revisit questions of political economy from this new angle, this what Gabriel has been calling the environmental logic. I think environmental logic would probably go like here. And then once you have that, you can revisit political economy again. Something like that.
Yeah.
That's how I've been thinking about it recently.
Yeah, because I think one of the things I like about linear logic is it gives us a framework to kind of like then hone in more specifically on different logics and keep track of the costs of them, which would, I think, is one thing that differentiates using classical set theory like Badiou does with like something like linear logic for ontology, right? Because there is no sense of resource in classical logic.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other tangent, and I know you already gotta go. So I'll throw
But
that in
yeah,
my back pocket for another conversation.
Exactly. That's something we should really discuss because I have no idea how to make sense of that.
All right, well, thanks for hashing through the details.
Yep. Great meeting. Thanks, everyone.
All right. How are other people feeling? Are there any thoughts on all that math blabber, or other folks have things they want to toss in there?
I mean, I have one skepticism about state and revolution thesis. I think it was in that law paper by Badiou where he had those 3 models for change
Yeah,
according
I don't
to
really
those
know that one.
3 logics. And obviously he voted like for the mode B version. And then intuitionist change was reformist. So that was bad, but like still digestible. And then paraconsistency was simulacrum, I think he called it.
Okay.
And
what was
like,
this in?
and
I haven't
like
read
you know,
this.
like it feels like it runs against STP's strategy to like look at all the 3 modes and not say one of them is the abstract one, capitalist worlds, and the other ones are like concrete or fantasies or stuff like that. But all of them have abstractions. And so at least making an analogy from that, it seems to me that it would be at least interesting to see if there's a similar model of change to all of those 3 modes. That doesn't privilege, like
Yeah.
obviously there's like one cool guy in Badiou, among the 3 ones.
Yeah, because for our thesis, none of those 3 by themselves are going to be capable of introducing change. That's why we have a mode D. So yeah. Where does he make this argument?
3 negations, I think it's called. I thought you guys or you know that paper because he like openly talks about those 3 logics.
I'm sure like Gabriel and Dennis have probably read it. I'm actually like not very well read in Badiou. I'm not the Badouvian in the group. So yeah, I've taken most of the times I've read him are over 10 years ago at this point. So and yeah, I mostly just read so the 3 negations, is that like a paper or is it a chapter in a
It's
book?
just a paper. It's a short presentation he held at a law school.
Badiou's jurisprudence. Cool. We'll definitely check that out. That seems like a good thing that we should be able to, yeah, if we would need to be able to take that on for sure if we're also going to be relying so heavily on Badu. That's a good thing. Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the main differences is, I mean, I think Badu is just not, yeah, I mean, there's just so many differences in how we're approaching things. But I do think Badu is more in like the classic academic philosopher position of like just kind of ascribing interpretations to things. And I'm not, I don't know. That's part of my critique of him, so maybe that's not fair. But that's definitely something to take on. But yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I think the idea with them would have to be something more like 3 kinds of change from each one that are legitimate change, but none of which actually fully like accomplish the kind of revolutionary, like full overhaul that we're, would like to see at some point. That they're right, that we could see. Yeah, that's a good question. Is like, how would we conceive of each of the 3 modes as a form of change that does have some meaningful like transformation of social relations within a world without changing the overall kind of structure of the world itself, like let's say, like the last 50 years of neoliberalism and computerization, right? Like has completely transformed the capitalist world, except for all the core structures, none of which have changed, right? Like all the basic logic of a capitalist dominated world still holds, but especially if we're thinking strategy, tactics, all that, like we can obviously need to take stock of living in a post neoliberal precariat world, living in a world in which everything is highly digitized, et cetera, et cetera. And those are real, significant, huge differences. Just like, for example, like World War I was a huge nightmarish change, but it didn't really change the overall kind of like transcendental structure of capitalism, even if it had a complete world-changing effect on the capitalist system and its kind of like empirical reality. So yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. We need to be able to account for profound changes in terms of each of the modes that fail to actually overhaul the transcendental structure of a world, but are, especially from the perspective of organizing and whatnot, like are very real changes, and also just explaining people's lives, right? Like, why the world we live in now is very different. So,
at least that would enable you to get out of a position where, I mean, like let's say from those 3 perspectives, you're not able to see what the other does as change. So what I mean, but you with like a mode, let's say a mode B perspective, can see something like gradual changes, let's call them intuitionist. Cannot see intuitionist changes as changes because like he's more like into the all or nothing game. At least that's how I kind of like frame it for myself.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think like, yeah, especially when you look at like his interpretation of paraconsistent as a simulacra, like for him, like the very existence of a contradiction is, I think, for Badu a big problem in a way it's not for us, because But this also, I think this also touches on the fact that we start from a different interpretive or a different place in math to interpret it, because he does stay very much within like logic the whole time. And we've like really moved into the topology of these logics to try to explain how these look in terms of actual social relations, right? So for us, like a contradiction in paraconsistent is just two things with an overlapping border, which that doesn't seem to have any easy interpretation to a simulacra, but does fit a lot of like, you know, our stuff around gift exchange and kinship and whatnot. But would also explain things that Badiou, his philosophy is often not great at doing, which is like conceiving of how, for example, you build coalitions, right? When you build coalitions, you've got to like find different kind of groups and kind of glue them together on their overlaps of like common interest, right? So in a sense, like coalition building is all about mode A, right? Like finding those common grounds, like Gabriel was talking about, and kind of like bring them together. On the other hand, you could kind of say that one of the touchstones of like things like union organizing are much more on like mode C, right? Like you're trying to, like when you're building a union, you're literally trying to build like this, like Gabriel was talking about, that like higher kind of like packaging, right? And so you're trying to create a package around the individual workers to enable collective bargaining, collective organization. And so you're kind of like building up. And even the way you conceive of participation in the union has to do with like literally like your exchange time and value and all that stuff. So I think there's ways you could interpret different kinds of political organizing within each of the modes, which would then require, but also just recently coming out of a month at a Palestine camp and on campus and dealing with this is actually now I'm actually going to directly take on this challenge, Maurice, by like interpreting all these differences at the camp with these logics, because we had like Young Democratic Socialists of America who are very union oriented and have like that perspective. We had quite a few like folks coming from different kind of coalition backgrounds that tended to have more of like an identity politics background, and like the question of like all these different overlapping kind of identities. And then we had like I wouldn't say it's necessarily a debate, but I think a question of like what exactly it is like complete victory looks like versus like all these different like kind of negotiations with the state, which would be the administration of the university in this case, right? So that I think is actually a really good way for me to like dig into this problem practically. Because yeah, I mean, that was actually a very real issue. People had such a hard time kind of seeing the other people's politics. You know, you had certain groups, those socialists, all they can think about is like union organizing, and those like identitarians, all they can think about is like reducing things to race and gender and blah blah blah. But like this conjecture you're bringing up, which is like maybe it's the problem is that they can't see the change of the other two. That I think is a really good starting point to try to interpret what happened there, and also to start to kind of think through what would it mean to create a place from which to see those three kinds of change on their own grounds, and that would be like mode D or org or what we're calling the communist standpoint or whatever. Like I wouldn't. Everything I just said was very provisional. I would have to go through and kind of tease it out more specifically, but that's a really good challenge.
Now that you brought up the examples, I was wondering, I mean, Badiou's critique of the simulacrum, or how he explains that, if I have that correct in mind, is that you cannot be sure that something changed. Because, or you have the feeling that something changed, but maybe not. And this relates more with something, let's say, something like a change of perspective. Everything is the same, but still different in appearance or so. And this kind of, I don't know, I'm just jazzing around a little, but this kind of relates to for me to questions about race and gender and those things. That they often like bring forth a change of perspective more than
That's
and probably one
interesting.
doesn't have to see it that critical as Badiou does. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would have gotten along with Badiou as an organizer. I'm not gonna lie. I have a feeling he seems to be very like one way or the highway kind of guy. But I think that's a really good. Trying to find it. It's all. Do you have a copy of
I can
it?
just put it in a chat before
Awesome,
we
thank you. Yeah.
start searching.
It's paywalled right now behind a law journal. And law journals are the worst, probably because they know how to sue all the companies that try to put it out there. But
Yeah. Oh no, that was the wrong one. This is the correct one. The other one is secondary literature.
on that one?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, that's a good thing to look into for this.
Are we at a dead point?
I think so. I was already kind of dead coming into this. I'm surprised I made it this long. So, but I also were there any other thoughts, or Monica, did you have anything you wanted to?
I don't know. I've been always thinking about change, like the change in the boundary. That in the mode B, you just shift the boundary, or you like decide which one is out and which one is in the paraconsistent logic. Like as if the mode B intervenes and decides where the boundary is. And for the intuitionistic, it just sets some sort of boundary in the margin.
Mhm.
So this is from the perspective of mode B. I don't know.
Yeah, I think after this conversation, I'm more confused than when I came in about boundaries. So I feel like that's something we probably need to return to, because I'm not quite sure what it means, like in terms of having a boundary, like neither side having a boundary, that it exists, or with the cut that Dennis was talking about. So I'm kind of at a loss myself. I think it requires some more clarification at this point.
Also because we had this asymmetry as a property of mode B, right? So asymmetry which you can shift in this perspective and that perspective. But this didn't show up now in the model that how Dennis talked about it, right?
Yeah, I know. That's why I have to go back and check everything. I gotta make sure I wasn't introducing incorrect math now. Um, so yeah, I think that's homework. It's I'm gonna looking into the boundary stuff. So, um,
Like in mode A, you have some everything is for everyone, like, but only in a closed circle. You know, you have people who are in, and you have people who are out, and there are some people who are in and out.
mhm.
And when the mode B intervenes, I don't know, you set the boundary and you say he's a friend and he's an enemy, and you know,
Yeah, it cuts out any of that ambiguity.
like that the boundary shifts, and also the true and false switches.
What do you mean by shift and switch? In the you now describe the move from A to B, right? And where would be what would shift in your perspective there? Just to understand you.
I don't have an example. For example, when something has got written, like some sort of law. I don't know.
Like in the sense that once a law is introduced, it kind of retroactively like splits things that weren't split before into two camps, or makes distinctions that weren't like
Yeah, it
there,
makes
but because it's
distinctions.
law, it's a real
It's some
effect kind of thing.
sort of decision. I think the mode B is some sort of decision.
Decision, okay.
I don't know.
No, I mean that makes sense because in like mode C, there's always this kind of like scale. So I mean, there's a choice,
Yeah.
but it's not really like this or that. And then yeah, there's always this like middle ground in mode A where you don't, in a weird kind of way, don't have to make a decision, but you can only be true or false. And so yeah, you don't have a choice but you don't have a choice but to choose one of them. Yeah, I agree. Which also kind of actually that makes interesting sense because if you take that with the law, that really shows why you need to have not just a law but like a judiciary. You need to have someone who can actually make a decision on whether on like the correctness of those categories, if the boundary has been correctly like laid out, if the terms have been correctly kind of like distributed over the members of the society, blah blah blah. So you need and that's literally called, right, like the judge's decision. Like it's so that makes a lot of sense. So those are two good. So like trying to clarify more the kind of geometry and intuition of the boundaries, and trying to understand how out of these two different kind of gift and exchange economies, something emerges that allows you to make like a clear binary distinction and decision. And in fact, forces you to make a decision. It's not even that there's like a distinction, but an actual decision has to be made out of that.
like also something, it has to do something perhaps with opening and restructuring the black boxes, to decide what really is the material basis and what is what is non-social logic and what is a social logic in a situation.
It's interesting. So you open up a black box, you look inside, and then you decide you kind of like are in order to create another black box. Is that the idea? Like you're kind of taking the pieces and then saying this is what we really need now, and then reassembling into something else. Oh,
Yeah,
that is interesting.
like in the encampment, the problem with the people of color and their fears, which made some sort of alignment between the distinction within the encampment between those who were willing to stay and those were not willing to stay, and the logic, the racial logic of the environment, like the
That's really interesting.
so we have to open the black box and see what is. Like decide how to deal with it. I don't know.
That's really interesting. Like, how do we distinguish between these different kinds of modes as they played out at the camp? Isn't just about analyzing the modes, but how they actually kind of like took up pieces of the camp, disassembled them, evaluated them, and then said, okay, this is what we want to do to go forward. This is how we're gonna, which would then all seem to combine into the question of like, A, how do we choose what kind of black boxes to evaluate? And then when we do, B, what kind of methods of these three modes do we use to kind of assess them, or what combination or something like that? Oh, that is all good. Also just great for my brain because I've been trying to process the camp, but I'm always looking for new ways to do so. Both for politics, but also just for my soul. So
Guys, it's 2 o'clock here, and
oh,
I
okay.
guess Monica, for you it's the same, right? Or is it even?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the same.
All right. Well, I think that's a good. Those were great thoughts from both of you, and that's really helpful. So thank you. About the camp and also just in general. So and also I am going to take your challenge up, Maurice, about trying to think it through how to present more clearly on this stuff when I do next time. So
Yeah, I mean, probably. I mean, I didn't want to pressure you into getting like into.
no, it's no
but
pressure.
probably
No,
I'll write to you.
yeah, no, I don't
separately
feel
about
any
it.
pressure. That's really good to
And
know. It was already
yeah.
something I was like sensitive to. Hearing that is good though.
Yeah.
Because I want to, like, I actively want to try to, like, it's a big concern for me is how we teach this stuff to people that aren't already math nerds. So, no, I appreciate you giving me the feedback.
But I mean, what I was alluding to was that there might be also like other ways than you making things more clear. For example, that there are like maybe like some way of preparating beforehand, or like there might be more ways than just the pressure to clarify more. But yeah.
Oh, you mean like sending out videos ahead of time or something, or?
or giving a task ahead of the time, or yeah, I
Okay.
know, I don't know, but probably there are more ideas how to deal with that, and
Okay, yeah, no, that's really good. Yeah, we should talk about this more. I would like your input on what kind of ideas and stuff would be to do. So, all right, well, I'll let you both get some sleep. So, thank you very much for hanging out, and
Bye.
we'll see y'all soon.
Bye, Monica. Bye, John.
Bye.